Thank you for staying with us. Let's confirm audio with my guest, Dr. Kelvin Knowles. Doctor, if you can hear me, can you confirm?
I can hear you loud and clear, Felicia.
Great. All right. So my first question to you is, a new cabinet, despite deep disagreements, some say it's another historic first for the country. Do you agree they're off to a good start or not?
Felicia, good evening and good evening to your viewers. It was a start. Besides the fact that the start is a good start, it was a necessary start. It was almost like I think we can call it's safe to call it a restart, almost resetting what happened in 1994 with the historic first democratic elections in the country. And a lot of people actually, what they did was analysts, and there's one political party actually that used that as their slogan entering the election, saying that 2024 is our new 1994, and we all know what happened then. So it is a good start, but it was a necessary start. South Africa had to put on reset. But now the hard work starts actually after 30 years of the ANC's hegemony being challenged and actually being not threatened. It's actually not overthrown, but we all know that the ANC did not achieve the required majority to govern. Hence, we're sitting now with a government of national unity that was born out of necessity.
Okay, I know it's all rosy at the moment for a lot of persons across Africa who are not in South Africa. But they say despite this coalition deal, there are stark political disagreements between the ANC and the DA, which already came to light in the course of the negotiations. Can you highlight for us the major ones that you think are most likely to have a deciding implication for the coalition?
Yeah, Felicia, you see, on the one hand, there are political parties that are, of course, on the spectrum. They are similar in terms of policy. They are similar in terms of ideology. And then, of course, on the spectrum, you would have your dissimilar parties, whose views in terms of ideology and whose policies are quite entrenched and they're quite dissimilar to each other. And I can mention a few, for instance. But what coalitions require, the moment that this opportunity presented itself, whatever was said in electioneering before the elections, whatever views were held by parties, some of them are maintaining that view. And these parties are finding themselves outside of what is happening now. Those parties who realize that this is an opportunity to seize, and this is an opportunity to put South Africa first, they are the ones that took a step back and said, okay, although we have said prior to the outcome of the election, and I mean, you mentioned the DA, for instance, and the ANC, which represents the two main protagonists, the first and the second biggest party in the country in terms of the outcome of the 29th of May elections. They differ on the spectrum. They differ in terms of the economic viewpoint and the policies that they posit. But however, the opportunity presented itself, and the DA, for instance, had to backtrack and say, where they initially said we will never work with the ANC, not never. We won't work with the ANC. We'll be hesitant to work with the ANC. They now had no choice to get a foot in the door, to be able to affect these policy positions that they have, however divergent or different it might be from that of the ANC. They will have their foot in the door now where they can actually affect change. And we see with the cabinet composition that this is exactly what happened, although proportionally to the ANC, which holds 32 ministries or portfolios, they only have 6. They still now have their foot in the door, which they otherwise would not have had.
Okay, what is your assessment of how the African National Congress is adapting to sharing power with other parties so far?
I think for the longest time, for the past 4 or 5 electoral cycles, the past 30 years since 1994, this year marks, of course, 30 years of democracy and 30 years of ANC rule that went unchallenged up until now. It will be difficult for them to adapt. What is playing out now also, I think, is to a large degree within the ANC itself. There are dissenting views. And the ANC can ill afford to I don't want to use disintegrate further, but it can ill afford to entertain an entrenchment of factionalism, because factionalism within the ANC has been prevalent for the past 30 years, and especially from 2007 with the Zuma camp versus the Mbeki camp. And after 2007 at the elective conference in Polokwane, things just went downhill. So even with the before the announcement of the cabinet, and when the ANC made pronouncements, when the election results came out, and they realized now that they do not have the required majority, within that space, from the outcome of the elections up until the announcement of the new cabinet, the ANC had to sit. It's on record where it had to sit now and appease certain factions, because the extent of the factionalism within the ANC could most possibly have resulted in the president being recalled. So a masterstroke van Ramaphosa, it wasn't easy, I'm pretty sure, to actually appease not all the factions, most probably 2 or 3 factions within the ANC, and to make them realize and drive the message across that this is the only way we can still keep things together, by entering into a coalition or putting it out there that we are inviting parties to become part of this government of national unity, because that's the pronouncement that the ANC made. Actually, they had other options, but they've opted for a government of national unity.
Okay, the new cabinet is a result of tense negotiations that almost threatened to sink it. At one point, the president had accused the DA of trying to create a parallel government in breach of the constitution. Are we to expect similar outbursts in the future? And how would you propose they better manage outbursts similar to this?
Yeah, you see, Felicia, I think a lot of people, or sometimes we lose sight of the fact that coalitions is something that is not entrenched in South African politics, or in governance for that matter. It has been a phenomenon that has been prevalent in Europe for decades. Even the time that it took after the elections, the outcome of the elections, for the president and all these parties to get together behind closed doors and to reach out to each other and find consensus, is remarkably short if you compare that to what's happening in Western Europe. I mean, in some countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, it takes months, to actually form a government. In Belgium, even longer. So if you look at it in terms of quantifying the time that it took to reach a consensus, so we must not lose sight of that. To answer the question in terms of how volatile would it be, or how difficult would it be to keep things together, it will require, and it did require actually, a great measure of political maturity to realize that, yes, this is what we have said to our constituencies, but this is now the reality that transpired. And within this reality, we have to make things work. And I think, and I've said it before earlier on in this interview, I said that it was a necessary change, or as the president called it, a new era that was necessitated. And now we will see those 2 parties with political maturity that can put the country first and say that we've got to make this work by all means possible, or by any means possible. And no coalitions are immune to threats. Number one, it's how these coalitions are managed. In South Africa, for instance, at the local level, since 2016, when this phenomenon came to the fore, a lot of metropolitan municipalities that were governed by coalitions imploded because a lot of infighting and all of that. This is a national level. So both in conflict resolution mechanisms, ongoing consultations between parties, making sure that differences are ironed out between ministers and deputy ministers that might be of different political parties. In fact, there are a lot of them. Make sure that there's policy parity, there's no dissent. It's not going to be easy, but it's got to be managed.
Okay, do we have any idea how the decision-making process will work, and what veto powers the individual parties would have?
I think, again, if it comes to negotiation, I think everything comes down to what was absent at the local level, and I think with the gift of hindsight now, these political parties can look back and ask themselves, what were the things that threatened the stability of coalitions at the local level, and how can we best make sure now at the national level that we do not fall into those traps again. So again, it comes down to, and I cannot overstate this enough, that political maturity, putting the country first, and realizing that we have to make this work at all cost. So when it comes to policy positions, for instance, some of these policy positions, you look at the DA and the ANC, you've mentioned them earlier, for instance. Are they going to backtrack on certain policy positions, like, for instance, the land question, black economic empowerment? The DA feels strongly that should be sort of better regulated, and expropriation of land without compensation. The DA has got a problem with that, or is challenging that. But how much are you willing to compromise when it comes to policies? Undoubtedly, there's got to be compromises on policy positions. How far these parties will go, I do not know. And I think that is where the balance lies. The balance lies between how much are you willing to sacrifice, but not necessarily alienating your support base.
Okay, perhaps they've said one of the biggest and most contentious issues are the DA's opposition to ANC's national healthcare policy and to its Black Economic Empowerment Program. I want to ask, I know there are other issues, but what would be the implication of these disagreements for policy direction, and which party's ideology is likely to dominate? Because whether we want to say there has to be agreement, there has to be dialogue, there has to be someone who seems to be in charge. And the ANC, in this case, some would say, would want to do that.
Yeah, you see the ANC philosophy also strategically, and I mean, there's suggestions now floating around saying that the DA has been hoodwinked, sort of cut a bad deal, so to speak. But I don't think that's entirely true. I think the DA, if they do the introspection, they would know. Unlike some parties, of course, that were approached by the ANC, that came with demands that does not justify or did not justify the support that they garnered at the elections, and that itself put themselves out of being included in the government of national unity. Now, when it comes to these two policies, for instance, the DA feels that it is not necessarily assisting, it's only benefiting a few politically connected individuals. There needs to be redress when it comes to economic empowerment. That's the one. I forgot the other issue or other policy that you sort of mentioned. Oh, the national health insurance. So we know that the ANC, the DA went to great lengths. They challenged it in court, and I suppose it's still ongoing. So those are two very important policy issues of the ANC that the DA has got a fundamental problem with. Again, we will see how the DA's position now will unfold going forward. Because what the ANC also strategically and cleverly did was it maintained key portfolios, such as finance, for instance. Another contentious policy position of the ANC that perhaps you didn't mention is their foreign policy, the whole question around their support for Palestine in the war in Gaza. We know how the DA feels about that. So that's another issue that you can bring on with the national health insurance and, of course, NBE as well. So really, it will test the mettle of the DA going forward in engaging with really fundamental issues that they differ with the ANC. And if it's done in a mature way, if it's done in a realistic way, realizing that, okay, these are some of the things that we can sort of backtrack on, putting the country first again. So It's always for me a measure of how much are you willing to compromise for the betterment of the country, and not necessarily just push your own policy position.
Compromise is important. I mean, that has dotted your submission so far. But there are smaller parties in this coalition. What would be their role, and how much of an influence will they have?
Yeah, so out of the ministerial portfolios, I said that the ANC got, I think, 20. Or I'm not too sure about the exact number, but in terms of the smaller parties, you see, that is the thing. It becomes difficult because now they're part of the government of national unity. You cannot necessarily sort of ignore them. But now, again, you come in, you make your demands, you put it on the table and say that, I mean, the Patriotic Alliance said that they want home affairs, they said they want police. So in the bigger scheme of things, you have to accommodate these parties, but again, not necessarily key portfolios. So these minority parties that didn't get so much votes, but are part of the GNU, for instance, we'll see that the Freedom Front Plus leader has been made Minister of Correctional Services, the Patriotic Alliance's leader has been made Minister of Sport. We cannot also necessarily argue to say that these are soft portfolios, but certainly it does not carry as much weight as, for instance, your finance portfolio, defense, foreign policy, and so forth. What was interesting is that a party such as the Pan-Africanist Congress, they have been allocated the land portfolio, and that is something that is very close or very important for them. So it was a balancing act, and that is why it took a while, to find each other and to reach that consensus. And that's the essence of coalitions. It's to find consensus, is to reach an agreement, and to reach agreements and find a common ground. So these smaller parties are accommodated. We'll see that the small parties such as Al Jamaa, which represents predominantly your Muslim, support base, they've also been given Minister of Social Development. Or either deputy or the full ministerial portfolio, I'm not so sure. So it's important to also acknowledge them. The fundamental mistake that happened at the local level is that when these smaller parties were part of coalitions, they wanted a bigger slice of the pie. And they weren't necessarily happy with having mayoral committee positions of non-key portfolios. So now we're seeing at least that some portfolios went to the smaller parties, acknowledging them because they don't want to be treated necessarily as junior partners to any governance arrangement.
Right, so far we've talked mostly about the challenges and the avoidable potholes if they are to succeed. But what are the potential benefits of this coalition arrangement for South Africa's democracy and political stability if they're able to get it right?
Yeah, so I think firstly, investor confidence. Investor confidence will be boosted because what investors want is a stable and inclusive government, of which the GNU now represents. Another benefit, obviously, would be that political parties that were outside of government, in terms of numbers, and the ANC having achieved a majority for the past 30 years, during the electoral cycles, they could pretty much run a one-man show, so to speak. But now they're part and parcel of government, and that is a platform where they can enact social programs. They can contribute to making policies that are important for their constituents, to make their voice heard, and to affect change where it really matters. And it comes down to that power balance again. But it provides these smaller parties that otherwise would not have had an opportunity to occupy portfolios in government to now have that. The flip side of the coin, if you look at parties that refuse to be part of this government of national unity, and we know, if I can mention just two, the Umkhonto weSizwe party of the former president Jacob Zuma, and then the economic freedom fighters of Julius Malema. So they came with their demands, of which I think sort of from both sides, they required or demanded the removal of President Ramaphosa. as president of the ANC as well, should they enter into any coalition agreement with the ANC. Now, those demands were not entertained by the ANC. But now this leaves these two parties. And I mean, the MK party is the third biggest party, and the EFF is the fourth biggest party. But now what happens is that they, by remaining outside of the GNU, they are reduced to continuously being protest parties. And at the end of the day, we must not lose sight of the fact that these two parties, the EFF and the MK party, are just splinters of the ANC bloc.
All right, Dr. Knowles, I'm really sorry to interject, but we are out of time for this conversation. But I'm so grateful you were able to spare time and share your thoughts with us on this important matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.